Welcome to On the Issues. I'm Councilman Jim Waring. Joining me on today's show is City of Phoenix Budget and Research Director Jeff Barton. Jeff, thanks for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like I should just add reluctant budget director. You had worked for the little inside joke between the two of us. You had worked for the city for 16 years, and you've been the budget director the last 2. But you knew what you were getting into, so nobody's going to feel bad for you. But it is a big responsibility, and you've been doing a great job. We really appreciate the work you've been doing. We did a district meeting last night up in my district. We had a lot of nice turnout, a lot of good questions.
It's a lot of fun.
But obviously not everybody can make those meetings, so we're hoping to have you on to discuss the budget that we're actually voting on this afternoon. It's Tuesday the 23rd, I believe, so if you're watching this on tape, then you know, it's already happened, but we are discussing the budget this afternoon at our meeting, and I wanted to have you discuss a little bit about what's in there. Maybe first you could take us through, it's a long process. It's not like you just make up a budget yesterday and we're voting on it today. It's a long process. You want to talk through maybe what the last year has looked like in terms of getting this budget put together?
Sure. Well, Councilman, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. You know, our budget process is a very highly recognized process. We've received the Distinguished GFOA Award for the past 25 plus years. Our process it's a year long. You know, we actually start formulating the budget, the base budget for next year. We actually start formulating that almost a year in advance. So it's predicated on our 5-year forecast that we do in anticipation of the upcoming budget year. So we go through our series of reviews. So starting in October, we meet with all of our departments, get an idea for what they think they're going to spend in the current fiscal year, so we can compare that to the adopted budget that Council has adopted for the current year. We also then start projections and forecasting for the upcoming fiscal year. And again, what we were working from, the premise behind 17-18 budget was that we were looking at a potential shortfall, a deficit of somewhere between $9 and $30 million. But because of the hard work of our city staff and the direction from mayor and council not wanting to see a deficit, we sharpened our pencils and dug in really deep, and we actually are bringing forward to the council not just a balanced budget, but a budget that has about a $2 million surplus.
And I should mention Ed Zerker in that. He's been on the show before with his penny and everything. Sort of speaks to me because I'm cheap, I'll just be first to say it, but he talked about how they're really trying to wring, you know, every dollar has got to make sense, every dollar. I might argue we're not quite there yet, but that's through no fault of your own. I'll discuss those issues with my colleagues. But certainly we're spending a lot less to get the same level of service than we were a few years ago. A lot fewer employees, obviously, but also, you know, we've got 100 million plus in efficiency savings. And, you know, that's part of this process, is examining basically every dollar and seeing what we can find. So how do you go about that? I mean, that's a big part of your job.
Yeah, so what we do, we actually go department by department. And so when you think of the organization, think of the many lines of business that the City of Phoenix actually conducts. So my staff, we interact with the fiscal staff in all of the departments, and we go through every single department budget, line by line, cost center by cost center, general ledger item by general ledger item. So we go through
Which is available to the public.
It's available,
right? To the public. If somebody else wants to take this on and find out where the staff is wrong, we're happy to have you do it.
We go through, you know, lots and lots of data, loads and loads of data. We look at how much a department has spent year to date. So in October, we've got about 3 months worth of actual spending. So we'll compare this year's 3 months worth of spending to last year's 3 months worth of spending and the year before. Do some regression analysis, look at projections, and if departments look like, you know, on average, they're not spending their budget, we're going to whack it down. We're going to knock it down for the base year. So the base year doesn't obviously just carry over the amount of money that you had started with this fiscal year. So if you show us that you're not spending your money, and if you don't have good, sound reasons for spending that money, we're going to take it from you. Because we know council, as you said, we're not about being cheap, but about being fiscally responsible and spending wisely. That's what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I found when you're out in the world, you're a conservative. When you're at home, you're just cheap, and I will confess to the latter. I've got a family that reminds me of that all the time. So, or frugal. I prefer frugal, but either way. But so you talked about October, but all this time, so for the last year, you've been looking at the economy, trends, indicators, and so forth. You want to talk about who does that? It's not just you, obviously, so what kind of help you have?
So we have a group in B&R, and in Budget and Research. My staff, Tracy Reber and her team, they're actually responsible for doing the projections on the revenue side of things. All the other staff work on the expenditure side. We also, based on some feedback that we received from the council, specifically you a few years ago, we actually engaged with the University of Arizona to actually do some long-range revenue forecasting. Using some outside folks to get a second set of eyes, if you will, to make sure that our assumptions are accurate. So we've worked with them over the last couple years to develop a tool. It's an econometric model that allows us to really aggregate revenue data and forecast it out going forward. We're also participants in something that's called the State Forecasting Project, where we're able to see what other cities in the valley are doing as far as revenue projections. So we can kind of trend and get a baseline as to whether or not our assumptions are out of line or whether or not they make sense given the local economy. We also work with the state and look at the JLBC, what they're doing from a revenue perspective, and things of that nature.
Yeah, I was a little concerned a few years ago. Our projections were one thing, a little higher than almost everybody else, really, in other cities. So I think it's helpful to get outside sources. I think it's helpful to compare yourself to what are my peers doing in other places. And I think that served us well. I think last year you were off by 0.1. So that's, now, as you suggested at last night's meeting, some of that's luck too. That's world economy. You can't necessarily project these things. If you're off, it's not necessarily your fault, I guess is a way to put it. But it's good. The more accurate you can be, the more helpful it is to folks like us who are trying to make informed decisions. We have had mid-year course corrections in the past, but not necessary this past fiscal year.
No, I think that's a good point. Last fiscal year,
which ends June 30th.
Ends June 30th. So last fiscal year, we actually started the year off having to drop our revenue estimates because the economy had a little bit of a hiccup to start off with. This fiscal year, we don't have to do that. So we're trending exactly to where our revenue estimates were. And next fiscal year, we see continued growth. We're going to be conservative. So the 17-18 budget, which starts July 1st of 2017,
and runs through June 30th of
2018.
Yep.
We're projecting revenue growth of about 2.9%. And right now we're somewhere between 3.2 and 3.4% growth for the current fiscal year. So relatively conservative, gives us an opportunity if we have to correct something, we'll be okay. So
we'll just assume if the +3, the 3.2, the 3.4 held, then we'd have a little more money to roll over for the next year.
That's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct.
So, I mean, it's just to give people an idea of sort of how this works. I mean, there is a lot of thought put into it. I know you're already thinking about the next fiscal year when there's already some storm clouds ahead. As you suggest, that was also the case for this fiscal year, and that, has worked out okay, at least thus far. Now, obviously, we're almost at the end of the fiscal year, so hopefully that will continue. Never know what tomorrow may bring. But you want to talk a little bit about, so the last few months, we've had budget meetings and citizen input and so forth. Would you talk a little bit about that process and how that's incorporated? Sure. So what happens after we do the 5-year forecast and present that to council, we come back to the council in early March. March 21st this year, we actually came back with the city manager's trial budget. So we then take that trial budget out to the community. It's like our traveling road show, if you will. So from mid-April, we had about 17 budget hearings. Those budget hearings, we actually gave residents an opportunity to engage with the mayor, the council, as well as our city staff and ask questions and give us comments on what they like and they don't like about the budget process. Following the conclusion of all of those budget hearings, we then wrap up all those comments. Those comments are summarized and sent to the mayor and council on a weekly basis in the weekly packet. All of those meetings are also televised, and you can watch them on YouTube or Phoenix 11. Scintillating viewing.
I know,
it
is. It's a great show.
But important stuff.
It's important. And so then what we do is take those comments, and then the city manager works with those comments and goes back and engages with you, the mayor, and the council, and gets an idea of which of those things would you like to address if we have the resources or the wherewithal to actually have those reflected in the budget. So the city manager comes out with the budget on March 21st. It's got a little input from elected officials, but mostly it's your work behind the scenes and so forth, and that's what people are reacting to at the budget meetings. I think this year we had 230 comments and about 330 or so people coming to 17 meetings. Now, we've got 1.6, 1.7 million people in Phoenix. We got basically 200,000 roughly in each district. When you figure that in, it's great that the 230 comments came in. It's great that 300 plus people came, but that's not that many when we put it in that context. We don't even limit it, right? You could be from Scottsdale or some other city if you wanted to come in and comment. I don't know. I can't recall that ever happening at one of my meetings to the extent I know where people are from, but still, so it's really valley-wide. It's not even city of Phoenix-wide. So if you're listening to this, I guess the message would be we are sort of tabulating your input, and it is affecting things. So you sort of have a disproportionate, I guess you have a disproportionate strength really in your comments, given that so many people, millions really, are not coming.
But that does get incorporated, and I do think that's an important part of the process. And I am glad, whether I agree with the comments or I agree with any changes that are made, I do think it's important that people have their say. And so I appreciate you always highlighting that that's available to people. I mean, you talked about the staff that comes, and that's really underselling, because you're talking, when you say staff, you're talking about the police chief, the fire chief, the city manager, the parks director, the streets director. They don't go to every single meeting. But if you don't have the city manager, then you usually have his chief assistant or something. Yeah, so if it's not the chief, then it's the deputy chief. For one of our departments. So, you're getting the top folks at every single meeting, and I really think that's a helpful way for citizens to learn kind of what's going on. I thought that meeting we had last night with the Q&A was great. I thought it was a great meeting. And it's good to have this kind of dialogue and people to learn kind of what you do and what's going on behind the scenes. So at today's meeting, you're going to present the changes, basically. So we've already had a presentation on the original city manager's budget. You want to talk a little bit about the changes?
Sure. So in the original city manager's proposed budget, which we presented to you about 2 weeks ago, we had a few small changes. We increased the amount of funding that we were going to make available for arts programming, and we also increased a little bit of money for arts maintenance. And we were also adding some additional money to CAS, the homeless shelter that the city of Phoenix actually helps fund, about $30,000. So the big change between 2 weeks ago and today, we're adding about $125,000 of funding to the city clerk department so that they can actually engage the registered voters in Phoenix in the hopes of actually increasing voter turnout. So they're going to basically print up some cards, and those cards will go out to all registered voters, and then voters will have the opportunity to have their names added to the permanent early voter list. And aside from that, we're taking about $12,000 of the set aside that we had for next fiscal year and allocating some additional money to CAS. And so then at the end, we have about a set aside of about $500,000 that we're actually saying that our recommendation is that we set that aside for fiscal year 18-19, because as you mentioned earlier, we're looking at 18-19 already. I'm not trying to presuppose that the budget for 17-18 is already set in stone, but I'm looking ahead now to the next trouble spot, which is fiscal year 18-19.
And so, speaking about 18-19, this gives us an opportunity to segue into one of my favorite or least favorite topics, probably yours too, depending on how you want to look at it, the pension issue. You want to talk about how that's changed over the last 10 years or so? And I'll just preface that with our budget for this year is what, $1.27 billion. So I think it was 1.22 last year.
This year's 1.22.
Oh, this year is 1.22. Yeah, I'm sorry, I said last year, but I meant this fiscal year. So the fiscal year we're in right now, and then the one we're voting on today is for next year. Sorry to be confusing. Thank you for correcting me. But about 10 years ago, it was also about $1.2 billion, and that was the budget before I was on the council, before the downturn. So we're only just now getting back to where we were before, and a lot of that is driven by pension increases. I don't expect you to have all the numbers committed to memory, but you want to talk a little bit about how that's changed, where we were 10 years ago with those costs and where we are now?
Sure. So the pension is, right now, I think the city's biggest Achilles heel when it comes to the budget. Next fiscal year, as you've mentioned, our budget, general fund budget, is about $1.278 billion. Comparatively, this fiscal year, the current fiscal year, which ends in just a couple of weeks on June 30, is $1.22 billion. So it's about a $56 million increase between this year and next year's budget. That's driven largely by pension. We have pension increases next year.
That's almost 10 or 5% of the budget. Yeah.
We've got about $58 million increase in pension, and that's, if we were to take that out of the budget, next year's budget would actually be about $3 million less than current year's budget. So when you look back in time, the big driver for that is public safety pension. In 07, 08, our public safety pension rates were in the 20% range, so we paid roughly 20% of benefits to PSPRS, the pension system. Next year, those rates are currently anticipated to be between 67 and 63%, depending on police and fire.
So if you're paying somebody $100,000, $63,000 to $67,000, you've got to add on just for the pension.
Just for the pension. And so, 07, 08, so 10 years ago, we were, for a $100,000 salary, we were paying, roughly $20,000. An
officer or firefighter is much more expensive, and adjusting Correct. For inflation, that doesn't even begin to cover it. Correct. It's just much more expensive than it was for the same service. Correct. For the same person in uniform.
Correct. So, pension, there's been lots of reform. So the City of Phoenix civilian pension system, COPERS, we've done significant reform. The latest round back in 2013 You know, you look out 20 years, so over the next 2 decades, we're anticipated to save somewhere close to $1 billion. The police and fire public safety system, they've also recently gone through reform, and they're still working on the...
And that's at the state level.
That's at the state level. And they're still working on the mechanics or the mechanisms to get that pension reform in place. But over the next several decades, they also anticipate seeing significant savings. But before those savings actually materialize, we're going to see some escalation or some continued increases in the pension costs.
Some escalation is underselling. It's going up like a bullet in a lot of cases. You know, but the COPR system, the 35% of our employees who are not police and fire, that's leveled off. I thought we got started on that project too late, and I thought we could have been more aggressive in what we did. But regardless, what was done by voters, council had to send it to voters in spring of 2013. I think that was a March election, passed overwhelmingly. It's making a difference. So it was 86 million, I think, in this budget year, 87 million. So it went up, but by 1 million, not tens of millions, and that's a big difference.
Yeah, the civilian pension system increases by $1 million this year to next. The public safety system is roughly $58 million increase next year.
Yeah, which again, $8 million, just the increase,
just the
not
increase.
what it is, just the increase is about 5% of our budget.
Correct.
Obviously, any business that was effectively losing 5% of its budget year over year, really, or certainly over several years, that's you know, that's a tough nut to swallow, and that's why the city is struggling a little bit. Where actually, as you suggest, other costs are actually down from where they were 10 years ago, or even in this case, from 1 year to the next.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. So how? I mean, is there a plan to manage that? I know you've got the 5-year forecast. Obviously, we have no idea what the economy will do right now. It's trucking along okay. It's not great. We understand it's not great for everybody, but it's certainly better than it was a few years ago. And that's what you really do your estimates on, correct? So going forward, if there was a downturn or the pension costs escalated even more, what would be a way the city could cope?
So what we do in the 5-year forecast, we do a conservative approach, and then we do a little optimistic view. So we give a range in our 5-year forecast. So when we talk about 18-19, what we've been talking about is a potential shortfall between $43 and $64 million. And I'll emphasize that it's a forecast. It can change. You know, the forecast for
and that it's a range.
It's a range.
It could be somewhere in between there. It could be a little higher. It could be a little
Correct.
lower. It's the best estimate.
It is. And, you know, the forecast for 17-18, we were projecting a deficit between $9 and $30 million. And instead, we're presenting to you a balanced budget with a $2 million surplus. So that illustrates how much the 5-year forecast can actually swing from reality. A lot of that is because we have 18 months to work on it. You know, I'm already talking about fiscal year 18-19, which doesn't start until July of 2018. So again, we've got ample time. You know, the city manager and I are already working on different strategies. We're also working on revamping our budget process a little bit to try and, to your point earlier about the number of citizens that actually come to our budget hearings, we're looking for opportunities to engage more frequently with the citizens, maybe holding some budget workshops, looking for ideas from citizens on, you know, cost-saving ideas or cost-cutting ideas. That worked for us before when we had the Innovation and Efficiency Task Force. So we're looking at all those types of things. We're also looking at our vacancies. We'll continue to do that. You know, if we've got vacant positions, part of our process that's been incorporated over the last several years, if we've got vacant positions that have sat on the books and they haven't been filled in X number of days, chances are you don't need those positions anymore. So we look to jettison those from the budget right away. And so there's really no service impact when we do that. So that's what we look for. We also will continue to ask our departments for innovative ways to produce and provide the same services that they're providing today without trying to impact services to the community. So that's where we'll start, you know, and then we'll also look at opportunities to enhance or increase revenue, you know, so that's how we'll start the process.
So one thing that I get asked a lot about is the land that the city is selling. There are several hundred parcels that are already on the market, listed on the city's website. I think so far, and I think that's a couple of meetings ago, so it may have changed now, about $17.8 million of property has been sold that had been on the books for the city for years. Obviously, it has a couple things. It helps our bottom line with what you do with the budget because, of course, we don't now have to pay to upkeep the land. That's not somebody else's problem. Increases the tax rolls because it puts it back, presumably, in the private sector. We want to talk about where does that money go? How do we use that to help our budget situation?
So the first thing I emphasize is when we do sell land, it's one-time money. Aside from the money that, as you mentioned, that we use to upkeep those properties,
right, the savings
that's
from
the
not having to
ongoing.
spend.
That's the ongoing savings. So when we sell a piece of property, we have to look at all the restrictions and covenants that pertain to how we purchase that land. An example would be if we purchased a piece of property with bond funds, general obligation funds or bond funds, we have to first pay back the bond because we can't take that money and do something else with it when there's an outstanding debt on the piece of property. So we look for all those restrictions. We also look at actually where the money was, who purchased it. So we may have land that was purchased with an enterprise fund. And in that case, that money can't come back to the general fund. So it doesn't help our deficit, but it does bring money back into maybe aviation or water or solid waste if they actually purchased it. So we have to go through a little bit of an analysis, and we do that with myself, finance, the real estate group, and the CFO to analyze where the money has to go. And then if it is truly no strings attached to it, it's available for the general fund to help either shore up a deficit, you use it strategically. Again, I don't think we would recommend in this day and age using one-time money for a new ongoing program or service. So we just have to be smart about how those funds get used going forward.
And that's why part of the reason I mentioned, I think people think, we're selling this property, it's a windfall for the city. Well, it's a small, it's $17, $18 million. Like you said, it's just the year you sell it in after that. And a lot of it goes to certain enterprise funds or things that are not the general fund. So just because we suddenly have $17 million, we can't hire that many officers, and then obviously going forward we have to figure out a way to pay for it next year. So there are definitely things that are in flux. Another question I get asked, and I think you'll know the answer to this, is so the body cameras. So there was, I think it was $5 million budgeted. I think it was in this current fiscal year. We didn't do the body cameras. Can you explain where does that money go then?
Sure. So what we did with the body camera program in last year's budget process for the current fiscal year, we created a set aside. So it's essentially a fund that we set up exclusively for that purpose. So we have $5 million that we set in that set aside. The body camera program is still being evaluated by staff in the police department as well as the procurement section of finance. So for next year's budget, we simply rolled it over. So those funds still remain intact. We still have $5 million.
That same $5 million.
That same $5 million is still available for the body camera program. And once the police department figures out which direction they want to go with that and the procurement process sees its way through, that $5 million is available and it will be there for next fiscal year.
I talked a little bit, just switching gears for a second, about your long history with the city before you were the budget director. You want to talk about what you kind of learned in other positions and what positions those were?
So I started my career as a city in the audit department, and I really liked the audit department because I got to see all city departments. You get to see behind the scenes and help departments fix problems. You help them improve efficiencies and all of those good things. But it was always after the fact. And I wanted to see kind of the front end. It was always, as an auditor, you're looking at things after they've occurred, or you're trying to mitigate something before it occurs. So I took an opportunity to transfer from the audit department after I'd reached the level of a senior auditor and moved over to budget and research as a management assistant 2. So as a management assistant 2, I was given all of the public safety departments, and that's largely where I've built my career. I think the city manager likes to always reference me as this public safety expert. I think that's probably going a little too far in many instances, but so I spent 7 years as a MA2, Management Assistant 2 in BNR, specifically focusing on public safety. I then promoted to a deputy director.
Which is about 75% of our budget.
Correct. Yeah. And then I switched over and became a deputy director in about 2007. And then between 2007 and just 2 years ago, I was a deputy director and responsible for all of public safety, criminal justice, and the airport, and a couple of other enterprise funds. So I had close to 55% of the city's budget at one point in time under me as a deputy. And then my kids got old enough, the former budget director actually took a promotion in the city manager's office, and the city manager thought that I'd be a good fit for the budget director, and that's where I've been for the past 2 years.
So when we talk about the airport, how much money flows through the airport every year?
Hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah. People ask that question a lot. It's a $1 billion enterprise, obviously, But it's not out of the general fund.
It is not. It's an enterprise. So the airport.
But we vote on the stuff that's in it. So people ask that question a lot.
You do. It's a part of the city, but it's a separate entity from a budget perspective. It is a enterprise in the sense that it generates all of the money it needs from fees that they charge the airlines and passengers. So it doesn't receive any general fund dollars. They do rely on general fund support, so they have some support from our HR department, our finance department, our IT, and they pay for their fair share. But you have to be very careful about what you charge the airport, because the FAA has this thing called revenue diversion. They can't pay for anything more than what they're actually consuming. So we've got to be very careful about what we actually charge the airport. But to your point, the airport is an economic engine, not just for the city of Phoenix, but for the entire region. I mean, think about all the folks that fly in to attend, different events in other cities and towns and things, and it's a huge financial impact generator for the city of Phoenix.
Yeah, if you're going to the Super Bowl in Glendale, chances are you're starting your journey by landing at that airport.
You're starting here.
Well, it's fascinating. The money that you have to keep track of is amazing. So you've got the $1.2 billion, $1.3 billion of the general fund. Airport is hundreds of millions, $1 billion. The water department is about $1 billion too.
All in the operating budget is about $4 billion.
Yeah, and then sanitation is another roughly $1 billion. I mean, when you think about all the trucks driving around, all the people who are employed, it is a big operation and a big employer. And you were sort of the CFO, I would say. If we're the board of directors and Zerker's the CEO, maybe you didn't want to think about it that way too much. You sort of blanched when I said that, but it's basically true. I mean, it's something, we have an audit department. Maybe you could talk about that for a second. I serve on the audit committee, but the relations between the audit department, we've had, a few incidences in my time here at the city. We're always trying to upgrade, what we're doing. Certainly now with cybercrime, I mean, the city has been, I hate to jinx us actually, but the city has been pretty good, lucky, however you want to say it, when you look at all the big, Target and so forth who have been hacked. We really haven't had that issue, but you're, not for lack of trying, I might add, by outside forces, but you want to talk a little bit about how your department interacts with the audit department.
Sure. We actually, we have a really great working relationship, budget and research, finance, and the audit department. A lot of folks would never like to see the three of us gang up on them. Right. It's a kind of a motley crew, if you will, but we actually have a very good working relationship. Our city auditor department, and this goes way back to even when I was there, a lot of audit shops, they're based on, slapping wrists. They like to catch people doing things. Our audit department never operates from that philosophy. They're there to help you and to ensure that you're doing the right things. And so, we engage.
Offering good advice. I always find those meetings, I get good advice.
Great sound advice. Mm-hmm. If you look at from a training perspective, a lot of folks that have been highly successful in the city of Phoenix got their start either in the city auditor department or in the finance tax audit department. It provides a lot of great training because you're learning all the requisite skills that you need to be an effective manager, how to manage budgets, how to manage financial situations, how to do financial reporting, how to manage people, how to fix problems, so we are kind of like the troubleshooters. That's what I like about B&R. When I was in audit, you got audits. The audits could vary from year to year. But in budget and research, no day is the same. We do research studies on a variety of different things, operational efficiency studies, and we do the budget. So if you like problems and if you've got an analytical mind, it's a great place to be. It's a really great place to be. But the relationship between those three departments, audit, finance, and B&R, it's a very unique experience and a very unique relationship. Our bond rating agencies, when they come and rate us, one of the things they like is that those departments are separate. In some cities, some towns, the finance and budget section are one department.
Yeah, bad idea.
In some other sections, audit is a part of finance. Our audit is independent and reports directly to the city manager. My department, budget and research, is independent. We report directly to the city manager, and so does finance. So he has those three departments reporting to him directly. We don't jeopardize or our independence is there. We have the ability to do what we need to do and make recommendations based on.
It's a checks and balances system, and I think that's very appropriate. And while we have had incidences, for the most part, we may debate all day long about the things we spend money on, but we're keeping pretty good track of the money. I think that's a fair statement. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on. This is the second time we've had a chance to talk here in 2 days, so I will bother you no more. I know this is a really busy time for you, and I really appreciate you answering these questions for constituents in my area as well as citywide. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions or comments, please call my office at 602-262-7445 or visit my website at phoenix.gov/district2. And we look forward to seeing you next time on The Issue.